Before diving into this incredible story, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the bell. Every story here has something to say, and you won't want to miss a single one. The sun was slowly setting over Arlington, casting a golden glow over the city's buildings and streets. Passers-by moved leisurely, some in a hurry to get home, others enjoying the last rays of sunshine. In this ordinary atmosphere, a scene was about to unfold, one capable of appending an entire day, and teaching a memorable lesson. Marcus Johnson, a Navy SEAL decorated for his courage in combat, walked confidently after a day of rigorous training. Every step reflected the discipline, confidence, and mastery acquired over years of perilous missions. But that apparent calm was about to be shattered by a man whose intolerance and arrogance were beyond comprehension. Sergeant Gregory Miller, a police officer with a troubled past, had a reputation in the city as an authoritarian and racist, ready to impose his law even when it wasn't necessary. He had been watching Marcus for a few moments, irritated by his imposing build and military uniform. For Miller, the presence of a proud and disciplined black man represented a provocation he could not tolerate. As Marcus crossed the main square, Miller stepped forward, his weapon lightly raised, and shouted, "Hey! You! Stop immediately!" Time seemed to slow down. Passers-by froze, some pulling out their phones to film. Marcus's heart was beating calmly, but his mind analyzed every movement, every intention of the man who had just approached him. He knew the situation could escalate in an instant. Marcus raised his hands in a sign of calm, and replied in a firm but calm voice. "Sergeant Miller, what can I do for you?" But the response that followed was not an explanation or a reprimand, but a series of humiliating words and intimidating gestures. Miller, blinded by his prejudices, began to harass Marcus in public, ignoring the presence of witnesses, ignoring the law, ignoring human dignity. This simple incident, which could have been trivial, would turn into a dramatic confrontation, highlighting not only Marcus's courage and composure, but also the memorable lesson that Miller would learn, never to be forgotten. Marcus Johnson walked calmly along the sidewalk, his army bag securely strapped over his shoulder. The evening light cast reflections on his uniform, and each step betrayed the discipline acquired after years of perilous missions with the Navy SEALs. Passers-by looked at him with respect, recognizing in him the presence of a man who had served his country. But in the shadows, another gaze followed him with hostility. Sergeant Gregory Miller, a police officer known for his explosive temper and racial prejudice, could not tolerate Marcus's mere presence. Every step Marcus took seemed, in his eyes, to challenge his authority and his narrow worldview. Suddenly, Miller appeared in front of Marcus, arm raised, and shouted, "Hey! You! Stop immediately!" The tone was threatening, almost cruel. Passers-by froze, some pulling out their phones to film the scene. Marcus, despite his initial surprise, remained calm. He knew that any hasty reaction could make the situation worse. "Sergeant Miller, what can I do for you?" Marcus replied, his voice firm but measured, displaying complete control of his emotions. But Miller didn't listen. He leaned toward Marcus, his face twisted with anger and contempt, and began to publicly belittle him. He accused him of walking suspiciously, of attracting attention, and even of disrespecting the city he served. Miller's words were heavy with insult, but Marcus didn't react. He kept his posture straight, his gaze steady, conveying a quiet strength that contrasted with the officer's aggression. The passers-by, shocked by the policeman's attitude, began to whisper among themselves. Some approached, curious to see if Marcus would give in to the provocation. But the soldier, aware of his strength and experience, knew he had to remain in control of himself so as not to give Miller the opportunity to humiliate him further. Thus began the public confrontation, watched by a stunned crowd, which would quickly go beyond a simple identity check to become a memorable lesson on respect, dignity, and inner strength. The crowd around them grew. Some passers-by filmed, others whispered to each other, unable to look away. The warm evening air was thick with tension. Marcus Johnson stood motionless, his shoulders straight, his gaze fixed, while Sergeant Miller fidgeted, flushed with anger. "You think you can talk to me like that?" Miller yelled, his voice echoing throughout the street. You must identify yourself immediately. Marcus took a deep breath, knowing that every word he spoke could determine the outcome of the situation. His voice was calm, but each syllable carried the weight of his natural authority. Sergeant, I'm Marcus Johnson, Navy SEAL. I have nothing to hide and I haven't broken any laws. This response seemed to only make Miller angrier. He believed that a proud, military-minded black man had no right to display such public confidence. He tried to move closer to Marcus, his face twisted in indignation, but Marcus took a step back, undaunted. His imposing stature and self-control made any intimidation ineffective. Passers-by, who had been hesitant until then, began to intervene. An elderly woman said firmly, "Sergeant, stop. You have no right to harass this man." A young man added, "Yes, look at him. He's a soldier. You're going too far." Miller, already on the verge of exploding, ignored the warnings. Every word Marcus spoke, every calm glance he cast at him, seemed to fuel his rage. The situation was becoming critical, the tension was palpable, every breath, every movement amplified the intensity of the moment. Marcus knew that the slightest impulsive move on his part could be interpreted as a provocation. But he was determined not to be intimidated. His strategy was clear: remain calm, command respect through self-control, and let Miller's arrogance work against him. It was in this suspended moment, amidst a shocked and attentive crowd, that the true confrontation between arrogance and dignity would begin. Marcus was ready to show that true strength lies not in intimidation, but in self-control and self-respect. The crowd that had formed around Marcus and Miller continued to grow. The murmurs became louder voices, exclamations of protest against the police officer's behavior. Some passers-by, shocked by Miller's aggressive attitude, decided to approach and intervene. A man in his 30s, dressed in a suit, stepped forward and said firmly, "Sergeant Miller, calm down. This is not how an officer acts. You have no right to treat a veteran like that." Miller turned to him, red with anger, his eyes flashing. But before he could answer, a young woman spoke up. "Stop harassing this man. You are supposed to protect and serve, not humiliate." Each intervention seemed to shake Miller slightly, but his pride and stubbornness kept him in his position. He shouted even louder, trying to regain control of the situation. "You have no business here. I enforce the law." Marcus, for his part, remained perfectly calm. He observed the reactions of the passers-by and Miller with impressive composure. He knew that now was the crucial moment, every word and every gesture would count. He didn't want to humiliate the police officer with violence, but by demonstrating his dignity and composure. A murmur rippled through the crowd as a teenager pulled out his phone to film the scene and post it live on social media. Soon, notifications were piling up, and the confrontation between Marcus and Miller went viral within minutes. Miller, feeling his reputation and authority threatened, began to lose patience. His once contained anger was turning into visible agitation. Marcus stood motionless, waiting for the exact moment to demonstrate that true power lies not in force or intimidation, but in control and discipline. Bystanders were now actors and witnesses to what would become a memorable lesson, not only for Miller, but for all those unfortunate enough to believe that intimidation could command respect. Sergeant Miller grew increasingly agitated, almost slapping his palm against his weapon as if to intimidate Marcus. But the Navy SEAL didn't move an inch. His straight posture, square shoulders, and steady gaze exuded a natural authority that Miller couldn't ignore. Marcus took a measured step forward, each movement precisely calculated. He didn't mean to intimidate with violence, but his mere presence commanded respect. The muscles in his body, forged by years of training, seemed to silently tell a story of courage and self-control. "Sergeant," Marcus said in a calm but firm voice, "your behavior is unacceptable. You have a choice: apologize now, or embarrass yourself further in front of these witnesses." Passers-by held their breath. Some whispered, "Look at him, he's impressive." Miller, flushed with rage, took a step toward him, but Marcus didn't back down. Marcus's every move was a silent demonstration: he was fearless, and his dignity was intact. the people around him could sense the shift. The tension was still there, but now the power seemed to be shifting. Miller, who believed he had dominated the situation through fear, found himself confronted by a force he could not break, Marcus's self-control and respect. "Do you understand, Sergeant?" Marcus added calmly. "True strength doesn't lie in intimidation or violence, it lies in respect and self-control." Miller felt for the first time that his anger and prejudices had no hold on this man. He had been challenged, not by a weapon or a blow, but by the simple power of discipline and dignity. At that precise moment, the crowd began to applaud quietly, impressed by Marcus's composure. Every murmur, every admiring glance was a reminder to Miller, he was about to learn a lesson he would never forget. Miller's anger was now reaching its peak. Every word Marcus said seemed to push him deeper into his frustration. In a fit of impatience, the sergeant made a sudden gesture toward Marcus, as if to grab him or physically threaten him. But Marcus, trained to react in extreme situations, wasn't surprised. In one fluid, perfectly controlled movement, he locked Miller's arm, gently but firmly guiding him to a position where he could no longer cause harm. No shouting, no blows, just complete control of a dangerous situation. Stunned passers-by filmed the scene live on their phones. Everyone could clearly see that Marcus hadn't resorted to violence, but had neutralized the threat with impressive efficiency and precision. Miller, unable to free himself, felt his authority crumble before everyone's eyes. His face tightened with shame and frustration. He had never faced someone who could dominate him without raising a hand. "Sergeant," Marcus said in a calm but firm voice, "this could have been much worse. You chose arrogance instead of respect. Look around you, you're being publicly humiliated, and you're the only one responsible." The crowd's murmur rose to a crescendo. Some applauded softly, others murmured their admiration for the Navy SEAL. The live video had already racked up hundreds of views, and Miller's reputation was beginning to be questioned citywide. Marcus, standing calm and in control, had transformed a potentially dangerous moment into a display of control and dignity. Miller had just learned, in a brutal but memorable way, that true strength is not measured by intimidation or authority, but by respect and self-control. The tension in the street was at its peak. The crowd held its breath as Marcus Johnson, standing opposite Miller, stared at the police officer with quiet confidence. Passers-by filmed every moment, aware that they were witnessing a rare and memorable lesson. Marcus took a deep breath, then spoke, his clear voice echoing throughout the street. "Sergeant Miller, it's not your weapon or your uniform that defines your strength. It's not your rank or your title that commands respect. True power lies in dignity, in respecting others, regardless of their color or background." Marcus's words struck the crowd like lightning. Some nodded in approval, others murmured words of admiration. The lesson was simple but profound: true authority is exercised with justice and humility, not intimidation and hatred. Miller, humiliated and unable to respond, bowed his head. For the first time, he understood the full impact of his actions. Every word, every gesture that had been intended to humiliate Marcus now backfired. He had underestimated not only the physical strength, but above all the self-control and dignity of the Navy SEAL. Marcus continued. "Look around you. The witnesses here see what is happening. Your behavior does not reflect your uniform, but your arrogance. You have a choice: you can learn today and change, or you can continue in shame." The crowd erupted in applause, some shouting encouragement to Marcus. Videos posted on social media were starting to go viral, and messages poured in, praising his courage and composure. That moment, on an ordinary Arlington street, would become an example to all, that intimidation and hatred are always weaker than respect, discipline, and dignity. Marcus Johnson had just taught Miller a lesson he would never forget. As Marcus stood calmly, the crowd captivated by his composure and moral authority, the sound of sirens was heard in the distance. Miller's superiors had been alerted by passers-by and videos already online. Minutes later, several uniformed officers arrived on the scene, watching the scene seriously. The chief inspector approached, giving Miller a stern look. "Sergeant Miller, explain to me exactly what's going on here." Miller, still flushed with shame and anger, stammered out clumsy excuses, trying to justify his behavior. I thought he was acting suspiciously. But the live video, already viewed by hundreds of witnesses and shared on social media, clearly showed the scene. Every move Miller made, every humiliating word he said to Marcus, was etched in the memory for eternity. The inspector then turned his gaze to Marcus. "Mr. Johnson, we have been informed of the situation. Thank you for remaining calm." Miller's superiors quickly realized that the sergeant's reputation was at stake. His racist and abusive behavior had been exposed in public and publicized, and it could not go unpunished. Miller felt the weight of his actions for the first time. His arrogance crumbled before the eyes of his superiors and all the witnesses present. Marcus, always calm and collected, simply nodded slightly. He didn't need any further words. His self-control and dignity spoke for themselves, louder than any reprimand. The lesson was beginning to sink in: truth and respect always triumph over intimidation and hatred. And that lesson would have immediate and irrevocable consequences for Miller. Just hours after the incident, the situation had already reached media attention. Videos shot by bystanders circulated on social media, racking up thousands of views and sparking angry and outraged reactions across the city. Miller was immediately suspended from his duties, and a formal investigation was launched into abuse of authority, racial harassment, and inappropriate behavior toward a veteran. His superiors could not ignore the magnitude of the scandal. Every gesture, every word, every piece of evidence captured on the street made any justification impossible. Meanwhile, Marcus was praised for his composure and self-control. Local and national media began to pick up his story, praising the dignity and courage he had shown in the face of intimidation. Veterans, ordinary citizens, and even law enforcement officials expressed admiration for his handling of the situation. The air in Miller's office was heavy. He had been confronted with his own arrogance and prejudices in the most public way possible. The sergeant realized that his career, his reputation, and his honor were now in the hands of internal justice and public opinion. Marcus, however, calmly returned to his life. But that day, he had sent a clear message to everyone: true authority is not measured by fear or hatred, but by respect, discipline, and self-control. The lesson had been taught, and it would remain etched in the memory of all who witnessed this confrontation. After the events on the street and the immediate suspension, Miller found himself alone in the silence of his apartment. For the first time in a long time, he was confronted with himself, his prejudices, and the magnitude of his actions. Images of Marcus, calm and self-possessed, continued to replay in his head. Every movement, every word, every gesture of dignity seemed to silently taunt him. He saw the scene again: Marcus's measured stride, his perfect body control, his firm but calm voice echoing throughout the street. Miller felt a deep shame he'd never known before. The misplaced pride and arrogance that had guided him his entire career crumbled before the quiet power of a man who sought neither revenge nor confrontation, only respect. As the days passed, Miller began to understand a simple but harsh truth: his racist attitudes and abuse of authority had destroyed his credibility and his career. If he was to hope to regain the respect of his superiors, his colleagues, and society, he had to not only accept his mistakes, but also change profoundly. He then undertook a mandatory training program on fairness, respect, and self-management. Every session, every discussion with a mentor or psychologist, was a reminder of humility and respect. Slowly, Miller began to see that true strength lies not in fear, but in integrity and discipline. The confrontation with Marcus Johnson had been more than a public incident, it had been a mirror. Miller finally saw himself as he was, and he understood that change was the only way to repair his lost honor. For the first time, he felt a sincere motivation to become a better man. A few weeks after the incident, Marcus Johnson had returned to his routine. But the confrontation with Miller had left a lasting impression, not only on the officer, but on the entire community. Videos and articles chronicling his composure and dignity continued to circulate, inspiring tens of thousands of people. Young veterans and civilians alike came to Marcus to listen to his experience, learn how to maintain control in tense situations, and face injustice with courage and respect. His name became synonymous with discipline, moral strength, and courage without violence. Miller, for his part, continued his rehabilitation and training program. Although his path was still long and fraught with challenges, he began to understand what it truly meant to serve and protect with integrity. He knew that his career could never return to what it had been before the incident without real and profound change. Marcus, however, wasn't seeking fame or recognition. His goal was simple: to show that true power lies in self-control and respect for others. He had taught a lesson Miller would never forget, one that would resonate through the streets, homes, and social media long after that day. On that Arlington street, this simple incident changed lives. A lesson in courage, dignity, and respect was publicly delivered, proving that even in the face of intolerance and injustice, self-control and moral strength always triumph. Marcus Johnson left a legacy that would continue to inspire generations to come.